The Hanseatic city of Korbach, an important railroad hub in the north of Hesse. About 6 months after the outbreak of the Second World War, the residents publicly demonstrated their support for the Wehrmacht. In March of 1940, they gathered for a dinner of stew in the streets. After the swift victory over Poland in the fall of the previous year, weapons had been silent on all fronts for months, but the war remained present in everyday life. The aim of the event was to encourage the saving of resources and to convey another message on behalf of the regime. Whether soldier or civilian, everyone contributed to the war effort.
It's relatively difficult to speak of a civil society in National Socialism, certainly since the outbreak of the war, because what one would generally call the civilian population was also deployed on the so-called home front. So that's what he's saying linguistically, that all that was being done there was also part of the war effort, that scrap metal was being collected, that there were public stew dinners, which now encouraged conserving resources. So now this separation between soldiers and the civilian population is blurred, more and more, because everyone had to contribute to the success of the war, so to speak. And then in the first phase, while the war was still successful, they all felt successful together.
The war was also experienced in the capital. On the 10th of March, Heroes' Memorial Day was celebrated in public. 6 years earlier, the National Socialists had established the holiday in place of the day of national mourning in order to commemorate fallen soldiers. Here's Adolf Hitler with an emotional assessment of the world situation from his point of view.
Unser Bekenntnis an diesem Tag sei daher der feierliche Schwur, der von den kapitalistischen Machthabern Frankreichs und Englands dem Großdeutschen Reich aufgezwungene Krieg muss zum glorreichsten Sieg der deutschen Geschichte werden.
For the dictator, the key to success lay in further campaigns, which the German Reich soon quickly began. Ever since the Soviet Union's invasion of Finland in November of 1939, the countries of Northern Europe had become the focus of world politics. Great Britain toyed with the idea of sending troops to Scandinavia. The region also increasingly became a focus for the German Empire for a number of reasons.
First, the Germans needed a secure supply of ore for armaments via Norway, northern Sweden and northern Norway. Secondly, the Navy wanted to have further operation bases in the Atlantic against the British. And third, the British and French also saw Norway as an important strategic area to enable them to encircle Germany from the north. And as a practical matter, the Germans wanted to beat the Allies to it.
Die Deutschen wollen praktisch den Alliierten damit zuvorkommen.
Under the cover name Unternehmen Weser Übung, the Wehrmacht invaded Scandinavia on the 9th of April 1940. Germany's neighbor Denmark was quickly overrun.
The Danes offered no resistance at all and agreed with the Germans that the Danish government would remain in office because they realized resistance was futile.
In Norway, the Wehrmacht launched a huge air and sea landing operation. 7 divisions went ashore supported by strong naval units. Within a few hours, German units had been able to capture many of Norway's strategically important cities and harbors. But surprisingly, unexpected problems arose when they tried to occupy the capital.
The Germans had a very clever plan. They wanted to sail the cruiser Blücher through the Oslo fjord. At dawn on April 9, 1940, they were going to moor the quay in Oslo, and a band was going to march up to the castle with a ringing tune to convince the king that it would be better to place himself under German protection. And it was believed that the king would agree, and that there would be no resistance at all in Norway. Stupidly, the Blücher was sunk at the narrowest point of the Oslo fjord. The German military attaché was standing at the pier, waiting for the Blücher. Where is the Blücher and the chapel? And the German soldiers? They didn't come because it had been sunk. And this allowed the Norwegian king to escape. Norway decided, because he was not captured, to fight, to resist.
In the following weeks, fierce fighting ensued. The German divisions were opposed by around 60,000 Norwegian soldiers. After the occupation of Denmark, the Wehrmacht had numerous airfields in the region at its disposal to support German units in Norway. But there was no quick end in sight to the fighting.
There were several reasons why this campaign in Norway lasted longer than the Germans actually thought it would. On the one hand, the Norwegian army put up fierce resistance, even though they were surprised by this attack. And secondly, because the British and French still managed to land large numbers of troops in Narvik.
The ice-free deep-sea port of Narvik was of particular strategic importance. The ore imported from Sweden and northern Norway, which was needed for German armaments, could thus be shipped to the German Reich all year round. The battle for the city was correspondingly fierce.
Der Feind, der hier uns vielfach überlegene Truppenmengen konzentrierte, versucht immer wieder neuen Boden zu gewinnen. Aber unsere Soldaten stehen auf der Wacht. Die Engländer werden, wie so oft schon in den letzten Wochen, zurückgeworfen.
However, the reality on the ground was initially different.
At Narvik,
the Wehrmacht suffered its first tactical defeat of the war. The mountain troops under General Dietl were driven out of Narvik and had to retreat to the mountain ranges around the city. And Hitler went into a panic. He ordered Dietl to leave for Sweden and to be interned there. Dietl, however, said no. He continued to fight. He disobeyed one of Hitler's orders. He fought on and held out until the Allies withdrew. And that really impressed Hitler, that a general demonstrated these so-called defiant qualities like that. He fought and didn't give up. And that was something that impressed Hitler very much for the rest of the war. And it was a quality that he also demanded from his generals again and again.
The order not to surrender would cost hundreds of thousands of soldiers their lives in the further course of the war. After the Allies had withdrawn some of their troops, German units were able to recapture Narvik on the 8th of June. A few days later, the last resistance on the Norwegian side was broken, and King Haakon fled into British exile. After 2 months, Unternehmen Weserübung had come to an end. The German Navy suffered heavy losses during this time. It lost 10 destroyers off Narvik alone. Here is some film footage from a German military doctor in Norway. The pictures give the impression of a harmonious coexistence of soldiers and civilians. Even though there were isolated massacres, the Nazi regime basically pursued a different occupation policy here than in previously defeated Poland.
The Nazi worldview postulated a hierarchy of cultures in which Scandinavian culture was relatively similar to German culture for racial reasons.
The occupation of Scandinavia was seen as a special case, especially because a connection between the Wehrmacht and the SS as an elite institution and the local population was desired, encouraged, and not restricted in any way. Marriages were also possible there. Children who were conceived were cared for and looked after and were allowed to stay with their mothers. This was virtually an expansion of the Germanic living space, if you want to call it that, to its original territory.
Accordingly, the propaganda reported intensively on the campaign and the occupation. Joseph Goebbels allowed himself to be accompanied by a camera crew during a visit to Oslo. The Minister of Propaganda commemorated the more than 20,000 German soldiers who died during the campaign. The fate of the sunken ship Blücher is also mentioned.
Anschließend begibt sich Dr. Goebbels zu dem Ehrenmal der Gefallenen des Kreuzers Blücher am Oslofjord.
A pathetic glorification of a military failure. The newest ship of the German Navy at the time was hit by 2 cannons that were about 50 years old.
Das Motorboot passiert die Stelle, an der der Kreuzer Blücher sank.
2 further torpedo hits sent the Blücher and her several hundred crewmen to the bottom of the Oslo fjord. Since the beginning of May 1940, another theater of war had moved into the public eye, the German western border. For months, German and French units had been lying largely idle opposite each other there. It was a time of the so-called sit-down war. Although attempts were made to influence the enemy with loudspeaker announcements and other propaganda campaigns, there had been no significant military offensives, despite the fact that France had declared war on the German Empire in September of 1939.
The French didn't want a war either, and their strategy was one they used in the First World War. It was successful. A long war, a war of attrition, and at some point defeating a weakened Germany in an offensive. And that's the same strategy that they had now in World War II. So you waited, you hoped for a long war of attrition, in which you would then eventually defeat the German opponent.
For their defensive strategy, the French had built a line of massive military fortifications on their eastern border in the 1930s. Named after the Minister of War, André Maginot, the defensive line included bunkers and forts and was designed to protect the country. Like France, the German Reich had refrained from major military action on the Western Front since the declaration of war. Thus, boredom was the greatest enemy of many soldiers awaiting further orders. Despite its success, the Polish campaign had revealed clear deficiencies in the Wehrmacht that made another Blitzkrieg seem inadvisable.
It was interesting that the Wehrmacht didn't want a war against France, because all these generals had the First World War in their bones. How were they supposed to beat the French army with this Wehrmacht, which wasn't able to prepare itself, which had the Maginot Line to contend with, which wasn't neutralized, which had always been upgraded? How was that going to work? And all three commanders-in-chief of the army group were against it. Even a Nazi general like Reichenau, commander of an army, was against it. Everybody was against it, except Hitler.
Hitler had wanted to start the longed-for Western campaign as quickly as possible. At the Berghof, he became increasingly impatient in the spring of 1940. Time and again, the offensive he had planned for November was postponed, often because of bad weather. With the approach of spring, a fair weather front appeared, much to the delight of the Führer. On the night of the 9th of May, the dictator boarded his special train. The destination? His new headquarters, Felsennest, near Bad Münstereifel. From there, he wanted to lead the imminent campaign. That same night, he issued an appeal to the Wehrmacht, stating, "Soldiers of the Western Front, the hour of the most decisive battle for the future of the German nation has come. The battle beginning today will decide the fate of the German nation for the next 1,000 years." A few hours later, the Wehrmacht crossed the borders of Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg without a formal declaration of war. Strong airborne units supported the advance of troops on the ground. This was the case in the Netherlands, where the Wehrmacht advanced rapidly. Nazi propaganda proudly reported on the military successes.
In kühnem Handstreich wird eine Brücke über den Julianerkanal genommen, ehe sie von den Holländern in die Luft gesprengt werden konnte.
In fact, the Dutch army was no match for the Wehrmacht. Only 8 infantry divisions and a small number of armored units were able to resist the German invasion. By the 14th of May, ceasefire negotiations had begun. To emphasize their demands, the Wehrmacht threatened to use its air force on the still embattled city of Rotterdam.
An ultimatum was issued. From the German point of view, the Dutch didn't answer in time. And when the Dutch did reply, the Germans tried to call off the attack. However, it was too late. Only part of the air force could be recalled, and the remaining air force left large parts of Rotterdam in ruins.
Over 800 civilians were killed in the German Luftwaffe attack on the afternoon of the 14th of May, 1940. 80% of the historic Old Town went up in flames. The ruthless bombardment achieved its aim. On the evening of the same day, Holland's surrender was announced. Queen Wilhelmina had already gone into exile in Britain. After the invasion by German troops of Belgium and the Netherlands, the French High Command assumed that the expected German attack on France would take place via these two states. That was how Germany had attacked the Grande Nation in the Great War. Consequently, France moved numerous divisions to this region to repel the expected attack there. However, the Germans pursued a different tactic from that of 26 years earlier. The idea, which had become known as the Sichel-Schnitt-Plan, called for the strongest German advance to be made through the Ardennes. The Sauer in the southern Eifel. The river here forms the border between Germany and Luxembourg. The small duchy was one of the first stages for the planned advance of the Wehrmacht through the Ardennes.
The Ardennes is a wooded, hilly area with relatively poor infrastructure and is therefore a place where no one would have thought that the Germans would attack there with their tank forces. However, the Germans did the unexpected and completely surprised the enemy.
Lieutenant General Erich von Manstein had designed the operation. The World War I veteran quickly convinced Hitler to go along with his plan. The Allies reacted as expected and advanced with strong units against the German advance in the north. Largely unnoticed, German units pushed through the Ardennes at the same time. After crossing the Meuse River at Sedan, they swung north and advanced to the coast of the English Channel. Thus were the Allied units routed. On the morning of the 10th of May, the plan was put into action. With over 40,000 vehicles and 45 divisions, Army Group A, under Colonel General Gerd von Rundstedt, set out in the central section of the front. In order to keep the strength of the advance a secret from the enemy for as long as possible, it had to proceed quickly. Within a few hours, Luxembourg had been crossed. Although there were roadblocks, the country's lightly armed forces, which totaled about 1,200, had previously received orders not to oppose the attackers. The result of the operation, which lasted about 180 minutes on the part of the Grand Duchy, was 6 wounded gendarmes and 75 prisoners. The German troops then continued their advance. Although the Ardennes were densely forested and the road network there poorly developed, the Wehrmacht managed to lead its tank units through the impassable terrain. The units played a decisive role in the success of the offensive.
In the interwar years, every army experimented with tanks. What was the best way to use tanks? The French, for example, came to the conclusion that tanks were best used in support of infantry as rolling artillery, while the Germans were the first to come up with the idea of mixing infantry and tanks together and letting them operate separately from the rest of the troops.
Und lässt sie getrennt von restlichen Truppen operieren.
In other words, the tank units could lead a battle independently and thus manage to bring a momentum to the battlefield, which the enemy couldn't withstand.
One of the most popular generals of the Panzertruppe, the tank armored units, was Heinz Guderian. His corps consisted of 3 divisions and played a decisive role in the advance through the Ardennes. Here's Guderian at the Semois River in Bouillon, Belgium. The town was considered the gateway to France. The first units of the Wehrmacht quickly reached the town. A short time later, Guderian's units crossed the Belgian-French border. In 3 days, they had covered more than 160 kilometers and were on the banks of the Meuse River near Sedan.
The French protected their border with the Maginot Line, construction of which began at the end of the 1920s, and was a fortification like the world had never seen in modern history. The Germans, however, knew that this Maginot Line was too short. That is, it didn't go all the way into Belgium. And that was exactly where the Germans attacked.
Sedan, It was here that the Prussians had crushed French Emperor Napoleon III in 1870. Including World War I, the city was now the target of a German attack for the third time in 70 years. Guderian called for air support. For many hours, 850 fighter planes bombed enemy positions on the Meuse River. Then, the artillery opened fire before German units managed to cross the river at several points. The Frenchman seems to have taken leave of his senses, noted the commander-in-chief of the Army Group B, Fedor von Bock. Otherwise, he could have prevented it. Again, it was also Guderian who had pushed the advance.
Guderian was one of the pioneers of German armored weapons use. He achieved a decisive breakthrough just a few days after the start of the offensive at Sedan, which brought the German forces into the interior of France.
As envisaged in Operation Sichelschnitt, or the Sickle Cut Plan, the German units then made a swing northward. On their way to the coast of the English Channel, they met resistance.
Französische Panzer greifen an.
France had modern tanks, but they were used primarily as auxiliary weapons of the slow-moving infantry. The German approach was quite different.
This war of movement that the Wehrmacht waged was revolutionary in its tactical operational concept. Nobody expected it. It was a surprise, and the Germans came up against a French army that was mentally stuck in World War I and couldn't deal with it. And it was a catastrophic defeat, and thus the French were not able to exploit German moments of weakness that existed.
One German unit managed to cover 120 kilometers in a single day. Faced with this speed, many French soldiers panicked and fled or were captured. Their high command couldn't come up with an adequate response to the German offensive.
Thinking on the spot, making quick decisions. This was not something that French military doctrine favored at this time. All decisions first had to be brought down from the very top, whereas German commanders very often made decisions spontaneously on the spot, sometimes even against the wishes of their superiors.
Traditionally, the infantry determined the pace of the advance, as it had to secure its flanks. However, since the beginning of the campaign, generals of the tank divisions had been breaking with this rule and succeeded in doing so. Their behavior, nevertheless, caused controversy in the high command of the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, Allied formations were increasingly on the defensive. The British Expeditionary Force and French units had retreated to the Channel coast and regrouped at Dunkirk. On the 24th of May, German units were less than 20 kilometers from the French city when a dispute within the General Staff escalated over the speed of the advance. Hitler put his foot down and ended the dispute with a fateful decision.
Then, just outside Dunkirk, near the Channel coast, Hitler's famous halt order came at the end of May. Instead of having his tank forces approach the Channel, Hitler gave the order, "No, stop. No further here." Since then, there has been much speculation. What actually prompted Hitler to give this order? The most likely variant seems to be that Hitler gave this order to chastise his generals again. The backstory was that weeks earlier, many of his generals didn't follow his orders and simply advanced with their tank forces as they saw fit, as they judged the situation. And Hitler wanted to restore his authority, so to speak, with this Dunkirk order.
It wasn't until 2 days later that the order to halt was lifted. The forced pause had bought the Allies precious time. Under the codename Operation Dynamo, a huge evacuation mission had been undertaken. An armada of several hundred ships launched from Britain to help the troops escape. The Germans tried to prevent the operation.
Eine B-Stelle an der Küste beobachtet die Flucht der feindlichen Flotte. Englische Zerstörer versuchen, die fliehenden Transporter zu decken. Deutsche Flak ist schnell zur Stelle. Überall wird blitzartig zugeschlagen und der Gegner immer mehr in Verwirrung gebracht.
But the confusion was only propaganda. Around 320,000 Allied soldiers were successfully evacuated. From the German point of view, it was a sobering result.
The order to halt outside of Dunkirk was actually a major defeat for the Germans, if you will. The Germans had failed to beat not only France here, but Britain as well. The best trained British troops were at Dunkirk. And as they escaped, it was clear that Britain still had an army, now back on the island, ready to continue the fight.
By the time the Wehrmacht was able to take Dunkirk on the 4th of June, 100,000 French soldiers had managed to escape alongside the British Expeditionary Force. They later formed the core of the Free French forces that continued to fight against Nazi Germany. The Wehrmacht mostly found just war materiel left behind in the city. In general, high speed had characterized the advance of the Wehrmacht. There was hardly any thought of taking breaks or sleep. Guderian had even requisitioned 20,000 tablets of the stimulant drug Pervitin for the 1st Panzer Division to counteract the men's expected lack of sleep. After the capture of Dunkirk, many soldiers now had a moment to breathe for the first time since the beginning of the campaign. Back home, people took a lively interest in the course of the war. Their thoughts were with the soldiers in the field.
Der Deutsche Rundfunk sendete von Berlin aus das Wunschkonzert für die Wehrmacht.
Since October of 1939, the radio program of the same name had been broadcast regularly by all Reich stations. The focus was on music requests from soldiers and their families.
Nun ein Telegramm. Soldat Karl Scheer im Westen.
The song requested was about a submarine captain, Prien, and performed by Heinz Rühmann and colleagues.
Mag mit seiner eingebrieften Füttern. Wohl bekommt gesehen, ob man schluckt. Die neue Luft bleibt nicht allein. Wir schicken andere hinterdrein. Du wirst den ersten Seelot schon erschüttern. Kapitän, Leutnant, Fried ahoi!
The show enjoyed great popularity among soldiers and civilians. Celebrities regularly appeared in the production of the propaganda show at the Haus des Rundfunks in order to grant music requests. Among them was Marika Röck, a 26-year-old actress and singer who was a star at the time.
Wir sagen gute Nacht, auf Wiederhören, wenn wir beim andern Male wiederkehren. Auf Wiedersehen, sagt das Vaterland.
Since the beginning of June, Adolf Hitler had regularly visited his soldiers. He traveled to places he had known as a private in World War I and other places in the war zone. Here, his chief pilot Hans Bauer filmed the dictator in Lille on the 2nd of June. Hitler showed himself to be down to earth, which included a snack at the field kitchen.
Why was that important? Well, on the one hand, to show that as commander-in-chief, Hitler was pulling the strings, even though he wasn't a high-ranking star general, and, as was generally known, didn't understand as much about the craft of war as he perhaps should have in this position. But it was, above all, to show presence, to demonstrate loyalty to the soldiers, but at the same time, to convey to the population the image of a defensible Reich Chancellor and leader, who was, above all, someone appropriately prepared for the future.
On the 28th of May, Belgium surrendered. After the capture of Dunkirk, the Wehrmacht was able to fully concentrate on the conquest of the rest of France. Fall Rot, or Case Red, triggered the second phase of the Western campaign. After heavy losses in the final weeks, the French were only able to put up less than 70 divisions to oppose the attack. The Wehrmacht then advanced from northeastern France in two main directions.
Eine dicke, schwarze Wolke liegt über der Stadt. Ganze Teile von Rouen stehen in Flammen.
On the 9th of June, German units had reached the Seine near Rouen. Some 500 years earlier, the French national saint Joan of Arc had been burned at the stake here. The symbolic city fell into German hands. In the process, Rouen's Gothic cathedral was threatened with destruction.
Deutsche Soldaten greifen sofort ein, die herrliche Kathedrale vor der Zerstörung zu bewahren.
The Wehrmacht as guardian of French cultural treasures. This was a distorted image created by Nazi propaganda. It wasn't long before German soldiers looted cultural and artistic items on a grand scale. On the 19th of May, General Maxime Weygand had taken over the supreme command of the French forces from Maurice Gamelin and had withdrawn his troops to the eponymous Weygand Line. The interception position ran south of the Somme, Ailette, and Aisne rivers. Despite this measure, it did not succeed in decisively stopping the Wehrmacht.
Der deutsche Vormarsch kennt keinen Aufenthalt. Jedem Mann steht das eine große Ziel vor Augen, Paris. Nach kurzen, erbitterten Kämpfen war auch hier die Weygand-Linie, die letzte Hoffnung Frankreichs, schnell überwunden. Bis Paris nur noch 37 Kilometer.
The government left the capital and fled to Bordeaux. On the 16th of June, President Lebrun instructed Marshal Philippe Pétain to take the nation's fortunes into his own hands. The 84-year-old veteran of the First World War was considered a national hero in his homeland, but the hopes that had been placed in Pétain were not fulfilled. On June 17th, he delivered a sobering radio address. It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today that the struggle must be stopped. A short time later, Adolf Hitler received a request for a ceasefire from Pétain at his headquarters. Here, we see a brief outburst of emotion with his circle of confidants. The hated Treaty of Versailles had finally been avenged in a symbolic way.
Der 21. Juni, Tag von Compiègne. Das Denkmal gallischen Hochmuts wird mit der Reichskriegsflagge bedeckt. Der Führer schreitet mit seinen Generälen die Front der Ehrenkompanie ab.
The Nazis staged the day as a humiliation for France. They met in the same railroad carriage in which the German Reich had to sign the armistice in the First World War 22 years earlier. Hitler had had the carriage specifically brought out of the museum for the ceremony. General Hunsinger took part in the negotiations on behalf of the French side. In the end, they crafted a treaty which said that about 60% of France would be occupied by the Wehrmacht. In the remaining part of the country, a regime was established named after the spa town of Vichy, which collaborated closely with the German Reich. For the Führer, it was a day of triumph.
Aus dem Führerhauptquartier eine Meldung von geschichtlicher Bedeutung. Der Ministerpräsident der neu gebildeten französischen Regierung, Marschall Pétain, hat in einer Rundfunkansprache an das französische Volk erklärt, dass Frankreich nunmehr die Waffen niederlegen müsse.
About 80 kilometers southwest of Compiègne lies Paris. Shortly after the negotiations, Adolf Hitler arrived in the capital for a visit. At about 5:30, his plane had landed at the military airport at Le Bourget. Next was a morning sightseeing tour in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower.
I think that was actually a private triumph on his part, a private, quiet triumph. The pictures that came out of it were staged beautifully. No background noise, so to speak, no people. But I think that for Hitler, apart from these scenes, it was simply about this personal triumph. To be there calmly, quietly with his inner circle, his entourage, in the lion's den, to stand there, to have achieved that, to be in Paris, to have defeated the fearful adversary of the First World War, and to savor that moment privately on a small scale. That, I think, was what that morning visit to Paris was all about.
Paris
is the world-class city par excellence, and for many Germans it was also a kind of place for longing. And Hitler appeared there not only as the little private from the First World War, but now as a leader and Reich Chancellor of the Germans in the capital of the defeated enemy. This was, of course, a great theme for Nazi propaganda, which they knew how to use.
At the Wehrmacht victory parade in the city, however, there was no sign of the Führer. On the 14th of June, after the negotiations, the 18th Army under General von Küchler entered Paris without a fight. What the Imperial German Army had tried in vain for years in the First World War, the Wehrmacht had now accomplished in a few weeks. German soldiers proudly climbed the Eiffel Tower and hoisted the Imperial war flag over the city. For a long time, the generals had opposed the Western campaign. At the moment of triumph, these concerns seemed forgotten. Hitler praised the men for the services rendered to the victory of German arms in the fight for the freedom and future of our greater German Reich, and promoted numerous generals to the rank of Field Marshal, including Gerd von Rundstedt and Fedor von Bock, the commanders-in-chief of Army Groups A and B, respectively.
Hitler very cleverly flattered the generals. He promoted many of them to Field Marshal. And being a Field Marshal, well, that was a special thing. Hindenburg was a Field Marshal. You became a Field Marshal when you took a fortress. And how many of them became Field Marshals? They hadn't taken a fortress, and they didn't really have any special merits, but they had the rank of Field Marshal. He showered them with medals, and in doing so, Hitler bought their loyalty to the end of his days.
A wave of euphoria broke out all over the empire. To celebrate the victory, church bells were ordered rung for 7 days, and flags were to be hoisted for 10 days. Soldiers who returned home received an enthusiastic welcome, like this cycling squadron in Bruchsal, Baden. Also, to celebrate the campaign, propaganda films such as Tanks Attack and Victory in the West were made. Tank General Heinz Guderian played a big part in these films.
Im Frühjahr 1940 standen wir vor der Aufgabe, den Durchbruch durch die verlängerte Maginot-Linie bei Sedan zu vollziehen. Wir waren uns darüber klar, dass dieses schwierige Unternehmen nur gelingen und der Erfolg nur ausgenutzt werden konnte, wenn Führer und Truppen sorgfältig darauf vorbereitet wurden.
Victory in the West hit German cinemas a few months after the end of the campaign and was very popular with audiences.
In the Third Reich, there was indeed something that these days was known as embedded journalism. In that war, correspondents were close to the troops, photographing or filming. And newsreels were then made from these recordings. Or a film like Victory in the West, which painted a very smooth picture of the war. Not so smooth, in other words, that there would have been no need to make any more effort, but smooth enough that there was never actually any risk of defeat.
Aber glatt genug, dass eigentlich nie das Risiko einer Niederlage bestand.
The war was depicted as a romantic male adventure without danger. Criticism of the military's actions was dismissed. Despite the rapid success against France and the Benelux countries, it would have been wise to discuss their strategies there.
Nowadays, when we think of the Western campaign of 1940, we very often still have all those Nazi propaganda images in our minds. Tanks and planes working together and a highly modern, well-equipped army. In truth, this was only part of the Wehrmacht, and quite honestly, just a small part of the Wehrmacht in 1940.
Nur ein kleinerer Teil der Wehrmacht 1940.
The French campaign was actually won by 10 German armored divisions. And the infantry, they marched behind just as they did in the First World War. And there you can see that the Wehrmacht had not yet then fully become the war of movement. They had done it in their minds, but there were great problems in actually doing it, because one unit was marching ahead, and there were huge gaps with the infantry lagging behind. This could be solved relatively easily in France, but it became a serious problem in Russia.
On Saturday, July 6, 1940, Adolf Hitler returned to Berlin from his headquarters. 7.5 years after seizing power, the dictator had reached the height of his popularity following the victory in the Western Campaign. The crowds cheered him on at Anhalt train station. The drive to the Reich Chancellery in his open Mercedes was a triumphal procession. The head of the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, General Wilhelm Keitel, proclaimed Hitler the greatest commander of all time.
As the successes came, he really became like a cult leader, in the sense of cult. There was a kind of godlike worship of this man, who was almost no longer perceived as human. And also, as he was depicted in the propaganda, that he hardly ever slept, and was always awake and cared for his people. So now it's starting to look like he's God Almighty, so to speak.
With the victory over France, enthusiasm knew no bounds. That's when people thought that we could actually walk on water.
It took just 10 months for Nazi Germany to gain hegemony over the European continent after the outbreak of World War II. But it would take years and cost millions of lives to liberate Europe and Germany again.